Now we're going to have a look at the rentable areas. First, I'll hover my cursor over the rentable areas button on the cost plan tab, and we get a little message saying measure rentable areas. This must be done prior to printing the cost plan if you require to print the relevant data on the cover page. So what this means is that rentable areas will simply be reported upon on the cover page. If you don't want to print them, you don't have to measure them. But just for the purpose of the exercise, I will show you what you should do if you do want to. So for example, you can say on the ground floor, I'm going to have some rentable areas because actually I'm going to have perhaps some shops or restaurants to let. There will of course be open areas in the ground floor, but I'll just make some figures up. Let's say ground floor, and we're going to say the ground floor we know is 900 square meters. Let's just say that we're going to be able to measure, I beg your pardon, to let 700 square meters of that. So I'm just going to put the figures in so that they will be calculated correctly. Rentable areas on the ground floor. Okay. And similarly, if I want to stipulate the offices, I'm going to fill in the description and then measure my offices, which were, I believe, 30 by 30 square meters, and that is going to be office space, and I will put in offices on the first and second floors, and as you see, it's multiplied by the office location factor, which is 2. And so on. Later on, I'll show you how this prints on the cost plan, but for the moment, I'm going to leave it there. And now for elemental quantities. If I call up the control tip, it says that elemental quantities must be measured prior to printing the cost plan in order to arrive at the elemental rate. That is the rate for any particular element. Remember when we looked at the cost plan library under core data, we saw that some of the items carried a flag which is ticked if a particular cost plan item is included in elemental quantities. It may happen that you measure a cost plan and some items, I beg your pardon, the items that you select for measurement are not part of the elemental quantities. In this case, the elemental quantity for such an element that you measured would be 0, and therefore it would not be possible to arrive at an elemental rate. I'm just going to go through the process of measuring elemental quantities. I will come back to this subject a little later when I'm more able with data to show you what the impact is of what you select in the cost plan if the cost plan items that you're going to measure are not flagged as elemental quantities. For the purpose of this exercise, I'm going to measure the elemental quantity of the substructure. And in order to minimize the entries that I have to put in, and also to make sure that if there is a change to the basement area, that my elemental quantity changes automatically, I'm going to use this process which we call AND-ON, which means that instead of measuring a dim sheet by putting in the required dimensions, I'm going to borrow the quantity from something that I have already measured. And in this case, it's going to be the basement. So I'm setting my location here to basement, and I'm going to select the basement quantity, which will automatically give me an ANDed quantity of 900 square meters. That now is complete. So I will click OK to return to this elemental quantities window. If I were now to return to the construction areas and change the area of the basement, you will see that my change is going to be reflected automatically on my elemental quantities. So I'm going to close that. You'll see I've updated my construction area of the basement to 1050 square meters instead of 900. And the impact of having ANDed it onto the elemental quantities now shows me in my AND-on slip that I have an ANDed quantity of 1050. It's important that you should understand how powerful those ANDed slips are, because if you make a change to the base measurement, anything else that was ANDed on from that dim sheet will be automatically updated. And now I'd like to draw your attention to the Guide to Elemental Estimating on the Help tab. This is the ASAQS Guide to Elemental Estimating for ASAQS work, and I'd like to draw your attention to the identifier at the top of the substructure element, which says that the unit of measure for substructure is square meters. If you look at the sub-elements or components as they used to be called below that, you will see that with a couple of exceptions, which I will discuss, all of them are measured correct to a different unit of measure from the elemental one. There is the square meter measure at the top. This one is linear meters, and that one, and that one. Column bases is measured number. Lift shaft bases are measured number. Columns below as linear meters. And then we have brick and block walls, linear meters, concrete walls, linear meters. Plinth finishes is square meters, but it is the vertical area or the area on elevation. So that does not actually comply with the elemental unit, which is in fact a horizontal area. Rock is a volume at cubic meters, and sundries contains the only items which are measured correct to square meters, corresponding to the elemental unit of measure. That means that if you don't measure anything in your cost plan which belongs in sundries, you won't have an elemental quantity, because sundries is the only component that contains the square meter measure.